From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's program, we'll be talking about the Biden administration and the Middle East, reflecting on the administration's first year in office and looking ahead to the challenges it'll face in the region in year two. There's a lot of ground to cover, but thankfully we've got two great guests joining us on the program today to help us make sense of things. Brian Katulis and Randa Slim. Brian is a senior fellow and vice president for policy at MEI. Randa's a senior fellow and director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program. Brian, Randa, welcome to the program, and thank you both for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Good to be with you.
Randa, let's start with a kind of look back at year one. It's been just over a year now since the Biden administration took office. Looking back, how has the region changed during that time, and what, in your view, are the kind of key developments?
Look, I think in a big picture, the region has not changed much in terms of its structural ills the region has been suffering from for a long time. It is a broken, dysfunctional, conflict-ridden region. There are parts of the region that are doing better than others because of oil resources, better leadership, visionary leadership. But, in terms of a grand picture, it's not a very nice one. Now, in terms of key developments in this past year since the beginning of the Biden administration, I will mention two developments, which I think give us some limited sense of hope. One is there is this trend of conflict de-escalation and tension reduction that has been taking shape. However, let me say, this trend remains very fragile, easily reversible, and events like the ones we witnessed recently with the missile attacks on the UAE, the Houthi missile attacks, more events of this kind can reverse this de-escalation momentum. But we have to say that it is a momentum and it needs to be nurtured. It needs eventually to be institutionalized. We are far away from that. And it's very much a result of the reckoning by the regional powers that their policies of confrontation have failed to achieve the objectives they set themselves for. And also partly by the increasing pressure on the leadership throughout the region in the different countries to deliver on the needs of the population due to increasing domestic economic challenges. So that's one positive development. And again, it is reversible, it is, it's fragile, but it is there and it can be nurtured and built on. And two, the second development is an increasing focus by the leaders, especially in the oil and gas producing countries in the GCC space. Their increasing focus on the ongoing global energy transition. And there is this realization in the region that this is not a topic that, the Americans talk about. This is now an issue that's very much of an existential nature to the people and the countries in the region. And the oil and gas producing countries play a crucial role in this transition to facilitate a smooth and stable energy transition, but also to ensure the stability of the global economy. We are still at the beginning. So there is a reckoning, but now there is, increasing debate in these countries about best mitigation measures, about national policies, to help smooth the transition, challenges, coordination across different sectors, especially private sector and public sector, role of energy companies, of financial companies in this transition. And there are now regional platforms like the Saudi Arabian Middle East Green Energy Initiative, which in my opinion provides a good platform to create opportunities for cooperation on the shared challenges by all countries in the region, including Iran.
Brian, what about from your side? What has stood out to you over the past year, building on what Randa said?
Directly from what Randa just last said, I think this energy transition is essential, and in part because one thing we saw this past year in the region was the effects of extreme heat on the region in key areas from Aqaba to Doha to Khartoum into Iran, and affecting basic human security, water, security and a number of things. The extreme heat events are occurring with greater frequency in the region and then also around the world. And I think that highlights the urgency of making this energy transition. And I think it's an important thing to note that the next two international climate conferences, COP27, 28, are going to be in the region. The one this year in Cairo, in Egypt, and then next year in Abu Dhabi. And that, to me, the negative challenges, the threats of climate change present this opportunity on energy transition and also an opportunity for a different type of diplomacy between the region and the rest of the world, and then within the region as well, because it's a shared human security challenge. And it's one, again, this past year, it's part of a trend, but it is one that seems to be worsening. The second thing I'd highlight, and even though it's not in the core of the Middle East, I think it had reverberations across the broad region, is the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, which I know we'll talk about U.S. policy, but when that occurred nearly 6 months ago, it sent a message, I think, across the region, not just about the United States and what it was trying to do for more than 20 years, but it also sent a message that many of the extremist groups and terrorist networks were watching carefully about how best to advance their agendas and maybe taking some notes from the Taliban, which had engaged in diplomacy, exercises in diplomacy, which I think were an important attempt. But at the same time, we're building and exploiting sort of the weakness of the Afghan government on the ground. And my point here is that, yes, it's important for Afghanistan, but it had reverberation effects all across the region into the Middle East, and not just with the flight of refugees leaving Afghanistan, but also just the message that this sent in terms of how other groups like the Taliban, who may have a similar ideology, might approach their own circumstances and could look to the future in ways to upend orders.
Randa, shifting gears a little bit to the U.S. policy side of things, well, of course, that's inextricably intertwined with Brian's last point. How has U.S. policy toward the region changed in that last 12 months? And what do you see as the kind of key shifts that this administration has implemented?
Look, I think we are fortunately back to an institutionalized policy where you have interagency processes working. Sometimes they do not do such a good job, as we have seen in the prelude to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but eventually they learn, they correct, and they move on. So that's good, because it makes this policy, at least for the region, understandable. They don't like it, some aspects of it, but at least they understand what drives it. They understand what are the interests driving it. Whereas contrary, for example, to the past, where we had the policy very much pivot around the whims and interests of one person and his family. So it is very much a pragmatic policy that is driven by an understanding of the limits they face in the region. I mean, after all, the region, the politics in the region have become really regional. I mean, the leaders there have their own interest, and given this, perception that is prevailing there, that the US is deprioritizing the region, despite all that US administration officials say to the contrary, there is this prevailing narrative and belief that the Middle East is no longer a priority in the Biden administration. And so they are starting to develop their own policies, develop their own partnership, their own alliances. But at the same time, I think that's also what's driving this de-escalation momentum that I talked about, which is a good thing. So in that respect, there is a reckoning, I think, with the US administration of the limits they face in changing the local actors' calculi. I mean, they are pursuing conflict prevention activities like they have done in terms of limiting the last Gaza war, conflict prevention activities in preventing, for example, failed states, like what they are trying to do with Lebanon, trying to prevent its further descent into a failed state, although I would argue it's already a failed state. But I don't see them, engaging in conflict resolution efforts, except maybe with the Iran, maybe on the Iranian deal, maybe there. But it's a conflict resolution effort of a limited nature, of a limited objective. But in terms of the conflicts that have been in the region for some time, from Yemen to Libya to Syria, I don't see them, taking a lead or, expressing an interest in spending some of the bandwidth that every administration has, limited bandwidth on these issues. And that, in my opinion, that's troubling because this is a region that has not yet evolved capacity to be able to solve its own conflicts. We have seen Iraq trying to mediate between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but this has been a limited convening role. It's not institutionalized, and I don't see yet the foreign policy establishment in Iraq having the skills to be able to maintain such a process in the long term. And I don't see others also stepping into that role of a broker, guarantors of deals to help end conflicts, whether it's the EU or whether it's China or it's Russia. So in the absence of that role being played by the United States, I'm a little bit pessimistic about moving this region from this conflict system it has been stuck in for some time toward more of a cooperative system of relationships among countries undergirded by institutions that work on conflict prevention and conflict resolution. I think we are far away from getting there. And in the interim, building on what Brian said, you have the problem of the non-state armed actors, which is really a major driver. It's a symptoms and a cause of. So it's a symptom of fragile institutions that have always been a problem in many countries of the region, especially in the Levant. But it's also driving this instability and it's sustaining this fragility. And I don't see yet a regional effort that can coalesce together involving the major powers of the Middle East around a regional effort to solve this problem, because it's going to require a regional effort. It's not a problem only of Iran. It's not a problem only of Qatar. It's not a problem only of Turkey. All of them contributed to the creation of this problem, some more than others, particularly Iran, but all of them need to be part of the solution to find a pathway to deal with this problem. And without this pathway, this state of institutional fragility and conflict system that is driven by that is going to stay with us for a long time. And as a result, you have a lot of problems emerging on top of what we are already experiencing in the region, from one of the largest refugee populations in the world to food insecurity, to inability to deal with climate challenge problems, to, fragile education, health system, a whole set of ills and dysfunctionalities that really the region so far has not been able to deal with.
Ryan, I'm keen to get your thoughts here as well. Do you have anything you want to add to what Randa just said?
Yeah, look, I think the Biden administration came in with a slogan, diplomacy first, when they talked about its foreign policy, including in the Middle East. But if you looked underneath the hood of that slogan, there wasn't actually much there. Certainly, they appointed envoys on Yemen, Libya, the Horn of Africa, and I think it was a positive step to re-engage in the nuclear talks in Vienna with Iran, indirect talks. But all of these things and all of these aspects, though welcome as they were, in my view, a shift away from the Trump administration's bluster, an approach that was quite erratic, but did things like tried to exert maximum pressure on Iran, and I would add the Palestinians too, and try to isolate those actors. The Biden administration had a slogan. It didn't have a strategy to connect what they wanted to achieve through diplomacy, whether, beyond sort of ending the war in Yemen or getting to new nuclear agreement in Iran. They really didn't work out the processes inside and to figure out a pathway to get there. So I think the aspirations were noble. The planning wasn't there, and the execution, I think, is quite lacking. And it's in part because the Biden administration quite clearly has tried to wall off the president himself from this region of the world. His engagements directly with a lot of the leaders have been limited compared to other presidents in their first year. They really tried to, in their view, right-size their approach to the Middle East, not set expectations too high. So if their style could be described beneath the slogan of diplomacy first, I think it's a style of technocratic managerialism, meaning they're trying to have a more predictable policy process, But the simple fact is there's not much appetite for them to invest in the region right now, despite what they might have said in speeches or what the mid-level appointees have to say. And the fact that the US is more focused on other priorities this month, it's been Russia and Ukraine. In the first year, it's largely been China, COVID, and the climate crisis. All of those things. I just think the sense that it wasn't as high as an agenda, the region reads that, other countries read that. And this posture incentivizes what I call strategic hedging among key countries in the region. Countries looking at dynamics between the US, China, and Russia and saying, okay, we're going to actually try to maintain our relationship with the US, but we're also going to build better ties with these other emerging powers because we really don't know what the US is doing. It also has incentivized countries in the region to adopt their own assertive approach in some of these de-escalation moves Randa's talked about, but also in some of the military moves or working through proxies to escalate conflicts. So right now, it's hard to predict what will happen, but I think the Biden administration approached the Middle East in its first year trying to limit its engagement, especially the president and senior level engagement. It had its Michael Corleone moment in the Gaza war, just when they thought they were out, they were pulled back in. But even that engagement was episodic and lasted only a few weeks, and they pivoted back to Europe and Russia in June. So they're heading into the second year with a lot of their assertions about diplomacy and what they hope to achieve in Yemen and Iran. And because they didn't think through the full spectrum of their strategy, they're coming up short on all of those fronts. And it's, again, not for bad intentions, it's just a lack of dedication of resources and attention to these issues.
Randa, looking ahead to year two, kind of shifting our focus onto the 2022 horizon, what do you see as the most pressing challenges facing the administration in the region in year two?
Let me just talk quickly about two challenges. First, that there are difficult choices that the administration will be making and have to make in dealing with a region where they have no democratic allies or partners, where conflict in the region will remain protracted, and where there is no pathway to a practical conflict resolution to any of them. Tunisia was the only remaining Middle East democracy, and now that experiment has pretty much ended. Iraq, Lebanon have election, but they don't have democratic governments. So this poses serious challenges to the design and conduct of a foreign policy that is undergirded by moral values, which are predicated on democratic norms. Although I have to say that despite the talk that we heard during the electoral campaign about values being at the heart of foreign policy, yet we see an administration that announces a $2.5 billion deal in arms sales for Egypt on the anniversary of the January 25 revolution, to a regime that has a strong record of human rights abuses. So that also speaks to some of the lack of coherence that Brian was talking about, and the gap between the ambitions, the statements, the talk, and then the action. And I mean, they're coming across, especially after this last announcement of the arms sales for Egypt, they're coming across like any other previous administration, too many people in the Middle East who basically accuse them of hypocrisy and not following up on their words. The second pressing challenge, I think, has to be with this narrative that I talked about earlier and that Brian also mentions. And it's likely to gain traction as the administration faces more of the domestic political challenges ahead of the upcoming midterm elections. This narrative that this is not as focused on the Middle East, its priority is not the Middle East. And this is going to be even more if we have a military escalation in the Ukraine, which is going to take a lot of the bandwidth of the administration, especially at the presidential level. And that means that this will increase the hedging behavior for a number of countries in the region, a behavior they have already been engaging in on a number of issues, thus reducing the negotiation space for solution and the ability of the United States, when it wants to play that role, to really push towards some kind of a resolution on any issue that it's working on.
Brian, what about from your perspective? What do you see as the biggest challenges on the horizon?
Well, the biggest challenges in the Middle East, I think, are the ones that we see in the recent headlines of this year so far, of the escalating conflict, not only with the Houthi attacks in Abu Dhabi and other places, but just ongoing tensions that could easily flare up in ways that will be difficult to manage, especially if the US is focused on responding to Russia and Ukraine. And I think for US policymakers, that will be increasingly challenged by the fact that Moscow has punched far above its weight in the last 5-6 years inside the region in many areas. State-sponsored mercenaries like the notorious Wagner Group remaining active in Syria and Libya, even in the Sudan, and recent joint patrols of the Syrian Air Force between Syria and Russia in the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights, and then just earlier this month as well. In addition, the naval exercises between China, Russia, and Iran. So these things I don't think are as strategic as what the U.S. does in the region, but Moscow has signaled that it has a presence in the region and it has some capacity to make life more difficult for the U.S. And I think it's one thing I know U.S. military planners are concerned about and looking at while this crisis in the Ukraine escalates. So that's, I think, a major challenge on top of a region that already is seeing civil wars, the rise of these extremist groups like ISIS reemerging. So it presents a lot of challenges. And that's why, I predict that despite the Biden administration's attempt to wall itself off from the region and not manage these issues, I predict that in their second year, they're going to be pulled back in, and perhaps in deeper ways than they had not planned. And I hope it's in a way that's constructive, that's focused on diplomacy. But my worry is that we could see the emergence of dynamics like we saw in 2012, 2013, when the Obama administration thought they were done with Iraq and then quickly learned that Iraq and Syria and the region was not done with them, and they were pulled back in. And I'm afraid that there are many different flashpoints that can pull them back in. And I'd rather see them adopt a bit more of an engaged approach that actually puts more substance behind their diplomacy first slogan, that works with partners in the region to deal with these emerging threats, that plans for contingencies, that if the Iran talks with Iran and Vienna don't produce a result, the key question is then what? And I'm not confident that the administration itself has a plan to deal with all of these while also simultaneously managing challenges with Russia and China.
Randa, both you and Brian touched on this in passing, but I wanted to kind of drill down in a little bit more detail on the potential impact of U.S.-Russia tensions and the escalation in Ukraine on the Middle East. What does it mean for the Middle East, and how you see that potentially affecting regional actors and dynamics, as well as the kind of U.S. capacity and bandwidth to deal with the Middle East?
Yeah, I don't think we are paying enough attention to the consequences on the Middle East, both short-term and long-term, of a Russia-Ukraine war leading to further deterioration in relations between the US and Russia. And just building on something also Brian has said, I think I would add, there is this issue of food security. I mean, in the short term, a war between Russia and Ukraine is going to have an impact on food security in the Middle East. Russia and Ukraine are among the world's largest exporters of cereals, and some Middle Eastern countries, especially like Egypt and Turkey, are their top markets. Especially if sanctions were to be imposed on Russian companies, that's going to also restrict the ability of these companies to export, these agricultural products to countries in the Middle East. And this will add to an already food supply crisis in the region that the region has been experiencing now for the last 2-3 years. On Syria, for example, there is this deal which has been negotiated in the UN to extend the cross-border humanitarian assistance to the northeast of Syria. That's going to come up for renewal sometime this summer. I think if there is this war in the Ukraine, between Russia and the Ukraine, and then, the US imposing severe sanctions on Russian officials and Russian entities, as the Biden administration has been saying and has been warning, then I can see that process also ended, and that will have grave humanitarian consequences, especially in a part of Syria, the northeast, which already has major humanitarian problems. A third area is Iran, the Iranian nuclear file. We have seen the Americans and Russian work closely in Vienna right now on pushing Iran to rejoin the JCPOA, make concessions at the negotiation table. And Russia and China, but also Russia has been playing a major role in that. And Iran as an issue area is also present challenges for the United States in general. And going forward, again, if there is a major deterioration in US-Russia relations, that's going to affect how much of a cooperation can happen between the United States and Russia on issues dealing with Iran, where we have shared interest on some of them. Take the Yemen conflicts. Russia and US have been until now sharing, pretty much a similar approach in terms of the resolution of the Yemen conflicts. If, again, the deterioration were to happen as a result of the war in Ukraine, I can see that becoming a theater rather than for cooperation between the US and Russia, more for competition between the US and Russia. And that will have repercussion in the whole GCC space. So these are some of the issues, short-term, long-term, that I see them emerge. Add to that is that this conflict is going to take a lot of the bandwidth of the US administration, especially at the presidential level, and that will also have repercussions on how much resources, time, presidential capital is being put toward in dealing with the issues and challenges the Middle East presents.
Brian, most of our conversation thus far is focused on challenges in one form or another, but I wanted to get your thoughts on the kind of flip side of the equation. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for the administration in year two?
Well, I think one of the opportunities we talked about a bit when we talked about energy transitions and the climate change issue, but I want to highlight that from a different angle. The fact that we're seeing more interlinkages between countries in the region to try to deal with practical energy and water security questions. We saw this recently in a deal involving Jordan, Israel, and the UAE. Those, I think, are important things to try to help a region of the world that doesn't have a lot of those interconnections address some real practical problems that connect with the broader human security challenges that the region faces. Again, these things, I think, are just minuscule and a drop in the bucket compared to what needs to happen for governments to be responsive and for the political economies of the region to be more responsive to the dire basic needs of a lot of people. But that, I think, is a positive way. And those pathways, there may be more openings there and possibilities. The normalization accords between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, I think there may be more coming, but maybe not too soon, because if these accords are constructed in a way that are like a bypass road around the Palestinians, it just won't sustain themselves. It won't produce the results that are needed to have inclusive security in the region. So that's, I think, another opportunity that if I were advising the Biden administration, I'd invest in more time in trying to figure out ways that existing peace accords could actually deliver tangible benefits to help improve the political and economic situation for Palestinians, as difficult as that is. I think that would be key. And I think it's also a pathway to try to open up new relationships. Again, more in the long term, I think it's going to take some time. And the last, I think, opportunity, which we've been seeing for a while, and it's been several steps forward and then several steps back, but there is just a new generation of leaders who are continuing to push for change, social change, economic change, political change. And again, it's easy to become so cynical because of all the hope a lot of us had and a lot of people had about the 2011 Arab uprisings and the changes that were brought to certain countries. 2011 brought some hope. 2021, 10 years later, a lot of those hopes were not met. But if you look at the structural conditions that exist in, I think, every single country, and certain countries are scheduled to have elections like Lebanon, others recently had elections like Iraq, and I know Randa knows both countries quite well. There's still this cadre of the next generation that has not yet seized the reins of power in those countries. And there's an enormous talent that can help remake those countries. And to me, again, it's easy to get too optimistic about this, and we should remain realistic given the cold, hard reality of authoritarian governments and the bleak landscape for freedom and human rights in the region. But what gives me some sort of hope where there's an opportunity for the U.S., and this is where the U.S. is not engaging as much, is direct engagement with those future leaders of the region that aren't currently necessarily in leadership positions, but I think maybe. And I would add Palestine to that equation as well, because you have an aging leadership there. So that's another silver lining, if you will, but it requires an investment in diplomacy in the Middle East on things that are non-military that this administration and then most of the previous U.S. administrations over the last 2 decades have not committed to.
Randa, I think that's a nice segue to policy recommendations for your end. What changes would you like to see in U.S. policy toward the region in 2022 and beyond?
I would like to see more attention to human rights and to the problems that civil society activists are facing throughout the region. We have seen a major decline in press freedoms in the region. We have seen a rise in targeting of civil society activists. We have seen rise in the prison populations in many countries, especially of political opponents of regimes. And I don't see we are paying enough attention to that. And that's something that I hoped and I really thought that the Biden administration will factor that in. And I have been personally very much disappointed in their performance on this score, especially when you hear senior administration officials says, well, the discussion about human rights is at the table when we meet with Arab leaders. Well, I've heard that from previous administration. I've heard that from even Trump administration officials. Oh, we discussed human rights. And I don't think it's enough to just have the subjects of human rights at the negotiation table. I would like to see the administration act on its promises of putting values and respect for human rights and democratic norms at the heart of its foreign policy. That's one key policy recommendation. And the other is to work on things that are achievable, especially to focus more on the climate change impact on the region and to spend more capital and to work with government, but also to encourage public-private sector partnership between the United States and countries in the region on different levels in order to deal with this ongoing or to accelerate this ongoing global energy transition and to create more of skill sets and political will and knowledge, in countries in the region about how to be part of this process. That's really, amazing in this country, but I think it's still at its beginning in the region. And the sooner that the region catch up with the momentum, the better off, because the danger it faces from climate change having to do from water access to food supply, the impact of that on health, rising temperature, sea level rise, extreme weather events like drought are even more extreme and will have more of an impact in a region like the Middle East, which already suffer from a lot of challenges. Is something that, we need to spend more time on.
Brad, what about you? What would you like to see the administration do in 2022?
Well, at the end of last year, I put out a report called Strategic Reengagement in the Middle East. And that's the top line, meaning that we've had a lot of talk here in Washington, and much of it's loose and not analytical. It's more advocacy driven about, well, we've just got to have a policy of restraint and pull back. But quite often, if you look underneath the hood of that line of thinking, it's mostly criticisms of mistakes made in the past, and it is stuck in the past, but it doesn't tell you what to do. And what I think we need to do, and this builds on what Randa just said, but what I said in that report at the end of last year had many things, but it was focused on how the U.S., and especially through the State Department and putting diplomacy in the lead, could do a number of things, and I'll highlight 3. One is to address these human security challenges. Randa talked about climate change, and we've talked about that quite a lot. And again, the fact that the region is hosting the next 2 international climate change conferences is an important opportunity. I would add to the comments on human rights and prioritizing it. If you look at Biden's Summit of Democracy in December, if you look carefully at these communiques that they put out, it wasn't just talk. I mean, there were ideas of policies. Those ideas can actually become policies if they're threaded through actual regional efforts. So that summit, for Democracy was a global effort. They had very concrete things on human rights and freedom protection in the technology space. And as we know in the Middle East, multiple countries have aligned with each other to use the tools of technology to repress freedoms. So if the US is serious about this, then, it shouldn't just be the democracy and human rights folks at the State Department holding seminars on this. It should be threaded through actual policy on the ground. So that's one, is addressing human security in its full spectrum. Two, more quickly, is that despite appointing envoys on key places like Yemen, Libya, there really hasn't been creative diplomacy to de-escalate those conflicts. And certainly with Iran, there needs to be a broader rethink that I think includes not just the nuclear file, but one that talks about the longer term regional security architecture and how to reduce these tensions. So a doubling down of diplomacy to de-escalate conflict. That diplomacy needs to be backed by security and security measures with partners, which leads to the third big idea, which I think, the U.S. military is moving there. As the U.S. tries to right-size its approach across the region and shift more resources to Europe and Asia, the key to this is actually developing deeper partnerships with the region, but not in ways that give those governments a blank check. That in a sense, for the last 40 years, the U.S. has had a security model of being the unrivaled regional security guarantor in this mostly hub and spoke relationship of bilateral ties. And what we're seeing increasingly is openings for integrating the capacities of countries in the region. We see this in missile defense movements recently to try to defend against the Houthis. And my point is this, is that the diplomacy needs to come first, but then second, the shift that the U.S. needs to make is away from this over-militarized approach where it's the U.S. troop presence that's the key question in our debates, and one that actually says, okay, here's how we're going to help the region develop its own self-sustaining regional security architecture. It's got to start with building trust and confidence through diplomacy, but it also needs to actually carefully manage the U.S. effort to get itself out of this business of just constantly sending its troops to fight fires and deal with threats that ultimately don't address the root causes. So it's an ambitious agenda. It requires the U.S. actually to do a bit more, but it's not in the way that the last 20 years were the costly ventures of Iraq and Afghanistan. If it's done carefully managed with partners, I think the U.S. can actually have a more balanced approach here. But it requires some more senior level attention on these issues. That's not reactive, that's not crisis management, but a bit more proactive. And I think being that proactive could actually help prevent the U.S. from getting caught in this cycle of responding to all of the fires and then, in a sense, helping others in the region address these challenges themselves.
We're running short on time, but before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to offer any final thoughts.
Yeah, the only thing, and one final thought I'd have, and this is a message to all of those who are concerned about the Middle East and work on it in think tanks in Washington or engage in it in the debates here back home. And it's try to up the level of the quality of the debate. There's a lot of, I think, advocacy agendas that drive the policy debate. And some of that is connected to our politics. Randa mentioned the 2022 midterms. And I think one unfortunate thing is that every single issue in America these days has become a partisan wedge issue in our politics. And I actually think that undermines America's ability to get to coherent, balanced, strategic approaches that put diplomacy at the forefront. And it's not only a left versus right or Republican or Democrat issue, it's within different ideological trends. And I think those who know the region and care about it most should take the time to make sure that they're looking for all of the nuances and seeing the region in its full complexity and seeing the people that live there and not simply using it as some sort of punching bag in our own fights. And unfortunately, you see that dynamic between some people, especially on social media and other places. And I do think that the best way to help America to get a better policy in the region is to do our utmost to actually enhance the quality of the debate through, an exchange of different views, but one that's based on facts and analysis and not just trying to drive some sort of particular agenda that's linked to our own politics or to other concerns.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Randa, Brian, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Randa Slim and Brian Katulis. You can follow all of MEI's coverage of the Biden administration and key policy issues in the Middle East on our website at www.mei.eu.
Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on today's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.